So you have made it to Trauma Informed Care Foundation. So we're building safe, resilient environments for staff and clients, which is so important. Um, and then I will also mention a little bit about our trainer. So on this next slide, Lisa Conradi has done lots of training here with us at CalTrin. We absolutely love her. We are so thankful to be able to work with her on, especially on these trainings that are so needed in today's world, where we really want our direct services or anybody who's working in our community feel welcomed, replenished, safe in their environments. That way we can continue to serve families. So she's a former executive director of the Chadwick Center, which is where CalTrin is housed in Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego, if you didn't know that. And so she partners with individuals and organizations to cultivate leadership practices rooted in resilience, compassion, and nervous system awareness. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with training in multiple evidence-based trauma-focused treatment practices and sought-after speaker, of course, because we partner with her, and consultant on trauma-informed leadership and systems transformation. So, um, I will hand it over to Lisa so that way we can dive right into today's content. And if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A pod and I will reach back out to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you to Lana for making this happen. It's a thrill to be here at presenting with California Training Institute. As Casey said, I've done this training for the last couple of years. I try to update it. This year has actually been completely updated. So if you've been on a past Trauma Informed Care 101 training with me, hopefully you'll learn something new. But it really is something I love doing and love being here with all of you. So welcome. So what we're going to talk about in our time together is we're going to talk about what trauma-informed care is. Some of you, I was looking at the pre-assessment. Some of you have been to many trauma-informed care trainings. You're just like little sponges that want to learn as much as possible. So you go to every training you can. So welcome to you. And then for some of you, you might be just entering the workforce and working with children and families and kind of systems, that's human services systems, and maybe this is your first trauma-informed care training. So regardless of how you've come into this and the experience you have coming into this, we're going to do some basic foundational. That's why we're a foundations course. So we're going to talk about what the guiding principles of trauma-informed care. We're going to talk a lot about creating safe and supportive environments for both you as team members and for your clients. So historically, when we talked about trauma-informed care, it was really all about how we can make sure that our environments are set up for the families we serve, which is absolutely critical, of course. But the workforce is the heart and soul of this work. And so making sure that trauma-informed care applies to the workforce is critical as well. We're also going to do a little bit of discussion about kind of bigger organizational cultures. We're going to do some breakdown on what's primary trauma, what's secondary traumatic stress, what's burnout. Those are all kind of different things. And we're going to talk about some interventions that are available. And then hopefully you're going to leave with some practical actions that you can take in your role to strengthen trauma-informed practices and promote resilience in your work settings. So I know we had the morning beverage icebreaker, but I'm really curious. We're gonna do a lot of stuff in the chat today, so hopefully you're prepared for that. What is one word about what brought you here today? So feel free to just go ahead and type that in the chat, like what brought you here today? Family. So thank you, Cynthia. Curious, knowledge, learning, growth, support, healing, information, development, learning, reminder, clients, accountability. Oh, I love that. Curiosity, implementation, improvement. Oh, so many good ones. Skill development, internship, um, working with K-12 students and families. Oh, so many good words here. Kids in trauma, correcting past mistakes. Thank you, Daisy. That's takes a lot of vulnerability to put that in there, and you're not alone. I can't tell you how many mistakes I've made over the years that I've been doing this work as well. Hopefully we all continue to be curious and learning, and I feel like I'm in the right crowd because that is what I'm seeing here in the chat. Uh, so feel free to keep typing those in the chat. We're going to go to the next slide. We have a couple of quick polls. So I'm going to ask Lana to launch the first one. And it's really just to get a sense of who you are. So what type of organization or system do you represent? So I've listed a couple of options, but there's also, if it's another, you can feel free to type that in the chat as well. So whether it's a child abuse prevention organization, child welfare, mental health. I'm seeing FFA, education, churches. Thank you. Wonderful. Healthcare management, parent educator, school social worker. So some childcare and some education. So I'll have to make sure to update um, my, bright paths. Oh, domestic violence. Spent years working in domestic violence. That's where I started. So for those in the DV field, I'm there with you. Um, Great educational services for those experiencing homelessness. Wonderful. Behavioral health prevention unit. That's one. And it looks like when I'm looking at the poll, about 20% of you are from child abuse prevention organizations, which is kind of the CalTrin's for everybody, but the original group is kind of that group that is identified for child welfare is about 14%, mental health 17%, and then half of you are others, which is what we're seeing in the chat come up. Family advocacy, child care, lots of great FFPS, wonderful. So we'll go ahead and I can actually share the results so you can see them. And then I'm gonna exit here and then we're gonna go into the next poll, which is what is your role? Are you an organizational leader, a supervisor? Are you staff on the front line? Or do you have another kind of role that isn't listed here? So we have family advocates, parent educators, behavioral mental health consultation for families in San Diego. So a local here, family advocacy, resource specialist. You see some leaders. Oh, there's the poll. Wonderful. Thank you. These folks are completing that. Pastor, consultant. Wonderful. Director. So lots and lots of diversity of organizations and roles. And what I love about that is there's just a depth and breadth of experience. So if you've been doing this work for 20 years and you're a leader, you come with a certain type of experience. If you've just entered the workforce, you're an intern, this is your first, we're in October 1st now, you just started your first internship. I loved working with our interns because the perspective that they brought was always so unique and really helped me continue to learn. So no matter how long you've been doing this work, you are welcome here with your depth and breadth of experience. So thank you. And then in terms of results, it looks like we have about 8% are organizational leaders, about 17% are supervisors, about 42% are frontline, and then about a third are the other folks that we've seen in the chat. So that's great. Wonderful. Okay, let's go ahead to the next. So I wanted to just set some grounding for today's session. When we talk about trauma, we can be really cognitive and take in the information and the education, but there are also times where we feel connected, where we understand what trauma is, where we might think about clients we served or remember our own experiences. I'm going to ask you maybe to reflect on some questions over our time here today. So I just want to have kind of some level setting for this work because we do have 165 of you. So there's a lot of folks on today, which is amazing. So the first is be prepared to reflect. You have your participant guide. I know that's been dropped in the chat. It got sent to you in advance. So use that. Take some notes. You're welcome to capture anything that's meaningful to you. Participate in a way that feels right for you. So I'm going to ask, this isn't necessarily, we don't do breakout groups in this kind of presentation, but I am going to ask a lot of chat questions. You can feel free to answer or not. What I would ask is that if you're going to be here, be here. So don't be doing 5 different things at a time, as much as I know that can be tempting. I've worked in the field, I know what that is. Um, but that doesn't mean you need to answer every question or be completely active, but just really participate in a way that feels right for you. You get to decide what to share and not to share. If you want to kind of be vulnerable and share, I think sharing about mistakes is something that I wish we all did more. So that can be helpful, but you don't have to share everything that comes up, right? Confidentiality. So no saying, hey, I saw this person post this thing in the chat. We're just going to agree that what happens here stays here in terms of personal sharing. We're impacted differently. None of us experiences this work or our clients in the exact same way. We bring our individual identities and histories to this work, and some are affected in one way while others are affected in another. There's no right or wrong way. I would say as long as you show up with an open mind, curiosity, and willingness to engage, you're on the right track. And take a break. It's a lot. 2 hours on a webinar with this kind of sustained attention is a lot. So if you need to kind of back off, like lean out and then lean in, lean out, lean in, that totally makes sense. That's how our brains are actually wired. So I'm just glad you're here. So those are our group agreements for today. Now, we are going to do a little bit of an overview of trauma. Some of you might be groaning right now. You've had a lot of um, trauma classes, you understand what it is. But I find when we're talking about trauma-informed care, especially in today's world where you can get on trauma TikTok and have people talk about what it is and what it isn't in so many different ways. I think it can get really, really confusing. So for me, I wanted to set the stage of when I'm talking about trauma, and this is really based on years of experience working with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, being a part of big initiatives, working with clients. That's kind of an International Society in Traumatic Stress Studies. I'm really pulling my definitions from that. And so I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page here. So when I'm talking about trauma, and this is what the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration identifies as trauma, they're really talking about an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that include the event itself, where there is threat or harm, overwhelming harm, right? So many different kinds of events kind of fit that category. There's the experience. So, how the person interprets and makes meaning of it, right? So, you and I might have been in the same room for the same kind of event, but we experience it differently. Some of that is objectively one thing happened to me that didn't happen to you. Another is it mixes with how maybe our history, our cultural background, our personal experiences, our intergenerational kind of experiences, those all come to play with how we might experience this particular event. And that the effect is this lasting impact on functioning, well-being, and sense of safety. So this is not, we know there's a stress cycle, and I talk a lot about the stress cycle in other work, where something happens, we get activated, and then we return to kind of our normal baseline. That is, there's healthy stress, there's things that we know things happen. We're all going to experience stress in our lives, and hopefully we're able to experience it and then go back to our kind of foundational level of functioning. When I'm talking about trauma, the event is so incredibly overwhelming that it alters our baseline, that it has this long lasting impact on how we engage and connect with the world and our profound sense of safety and being who we are and showing up in the world. And that is what I'm talking about when we talk about trauma. Now, trauma, I heard some quote the other day on some podcast. I don't remember what it was, but where the person's saying, I kind of think everybody in some way, shape, or form has experienced trauma. And she's probably right. Now, I have data to kind of talk a little bit about, but I think it's safe to assume that trauma is highly prevalent, that it is something that we've experienced, many of us, and most, if not all, of our clients have experienced, and that's often what brings them into our service, even if that is not the reason they've identified for coming into our service. So if you work with the homeless, they're looking for housing, but trauma is absolutely prevalent. So the impact, when we look at the studies, 61% of adults have reported at least one adverse childhood experience. Now, my main caveat here, I want to be really clear about this because I think ACEs and trauma get conflated a lot, is that not all identified ACEs would be considered traumatic events. So things like divorce. Divorce in and of itself is not necessarily trauma, right? Now, high conflict, high custody, all of that, it could potentially be trauma, but in and of itself, it isn't. So this is where the event and the kind of subjective nature of the event come in. So when I say this statistic about ACEs, I think that it's important just to know that not all of those are traumatic events. And but when we look at like the National Crime Victimization Study, looking at children and their experiences of things like gang violence, sexual assault, physical violence, exposure to domestic violence, kind of things that we would really identify no matter what as traumatic experiences, 2 out of 3 kids report at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. And we know that the impact over time is profound. So those with higher ACE scores are linked to chronic health conditions. That's a whole thing. You could look at the ACEs and kind of see some long-term impact on health, on mental health concerns. So things like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as substance use and misuse and risky behaviors, and that we know for our workforce, right? It's ours. I've worked in these systems my whole career. Those who are seeking the services are more likely to have experienced trauma, and those who work in the service are more likely to have experienced trauma. And it could be because we've sought the service and we found it helpful, so we decided to give back. It's because we feel we have unique gifts to give. It's something that we're familiar and connected to. Whatever that reason, we know that trauma is prevalent both in the workforce and in the clients we serve. And this exposure contributes to challenges with trust, regulation, so how we make sense of our emotions, and engagement in services. Now, there's a couple of different types of trauma that we work on. The first is this acute trauma. So this is often a single overwhelming event, right? So nothing else. It could be a natural disaster, an accident, or a single incident of something like sexual abuse or a single exposure to a domestic violence incident. Now, having worked at the Chadwick Center, which is a large children's advocacy center, most of our cases that came in were not acute trauma. It was actually quite rare to see acute trauma come in. Most of the cases are what we would call chronic trauma. So that's repeated, prolonged exposure to abuse, violence, systemic oppression. So event after event, different kinds of events. There might be living in a community where there's exposure to violence while there's also violence in the home, for example. And complex trauma, and I think that it's interesting because if you look at social media, complex trauma is having kind of a day. I've heard people talking about it who aren't in my field. I've been talking about complex trauma for a long time. It's been very interesting to see the narrative and discussion about complex trauma, which I think I welcome. It's something that I'm glad we get to talk about in ways maybe we haven't talked about before. But when I'm talking about complex trauma here, it is the combination of the chronic, so multiple traumas, but they're often interpersonal in nature. This means that the person whose job it is to take care of you, a parent, a caregiver, someone you trust, someone who's been in your life consistently, is the person who hurts you. And that often occurs starting at a very young age. And so for many of our cases, we see this complex trauma that occurs over time, and that we really, this has its own unique, profound effects on trust, safety, our ability to connect and engage with those around us. Because if you grew up in a world where the person whose job it was to take care of you is the person who hurts you, in many ways, they're teaching you what what you might think to deserve or how you might think to interact. And what we often see are folks then engage in those similar kinds of relationships as they grow up and get older. For lots of reasons. It's very complex. You could teach whole undergrad and graduate courses on this. So complex trauma is makes things how we interact even more complicated. And then we have historical and intergenerational trauma. So this is the cumulative collective trauma that is often passed through and across generations. This might include colonization, racism, forced migration. So these all kind of come together into this soup. Now, what I want you to do right now, we're going to take a moment, and it's on page 3 of your participant guide, is to reflect about a stressful situation and how that might have impacted your ability to focus or connect. It doesn't have to be trauma. I'm just talking about maybe you got a call that was disconcerting and you needed to show up for work, and oh my gosh, it got in the way of your ability to engage. How does understanding how that experience impacted your ability to focus maybe help you understand clients' experiences? Now, this is not for the chat. This is just for you. So no need to type it in the chat. Just make a note in your workbook. It's your own personal reflection of how maybe your own personal experience has impacted your ability to focus and really maybe help you understand client experiences. And a quick question from Cynthia: would families experience homelessness or possibly chronic or historical trauma? Absolutely, without a doubt. I would say folks who are experiencing homelessness often have complex trauma histories where they've been hurt by folks who were supposed to care for them from a very young age. I don't have the data off the top of my head, but in my professional experience, as well as in studies I have read, I think that is absolutely true. So I'm just going to give you another 30 seconds or so to complete that journaling prompt, and then we will go on to the next page. Okay. So you can always come back to it if you wanted to spend some more time thinking about that. But we're going to go ahead and go on to the impact of trauma on the brain, the body, and on behavior. So first thing I want to say here is we know from several decades of research and experience that trauma has profound impact on the structures of the brain, as well as how we engage and connect with those around us. And, I didn't have in some of my previous versions of this training, I have kind of the brain and we talk through it a little bit. I don't spend a lot of time in that. But what I want to say is what we know trauma does is impacts the parts of the brain that one are responsible for planning, execution. So that kind of frontal lobe, right? So we know that, especially in kids who've experienced trauma, that part of the brain does not develop in the same way for really good reason. So what happens when we're kids exposed to trauma, we are using all of our resources to maintain safety, to take care of what's in front of us, to manage, maybe if it's domestic violence, manage the eggshells that we might be walking on, right? Our brain is spending all of its time doing that instead of doing the normal developmental, hitting those normal developmental milestones. And so what we see is this longer term impact on the brain. Now, and that then is connected to our body and our ongoing behavior. So we see impact on trauma on our how we attach and connect. We see it on the relationships that we have. We see it on our sense of self-worth. All of these things are connected. right? And that's a trauma 101 that could probably be its own webinar, right? But needless to say, we know that there's significant impact in a lot of different ways of trauma on our bodies and our brain. Now, what happens, and this is why it's important when we're talking about trauma informed care and working within organizations, is that when a stressful event happens, and all trauma is stressful, not all stress is trauma, that our nervous system has a response. Okay. So you guys have all heard of these responses. There's the fight, which means something happens when you're stressed out, you're ready to go. We all know somebody in our lives who are just ready to engage. Folks who run, they might want to run from the threat. Those who freeze, so they kind of do the possum where they're just like, I just kind of look blank stare. And then this one may or may not be familiar to you. It's a little controversial in the literature, but it's the idea of fawn. So the pleasing to avoid the threat. It's kind of the Stockholmy, you kind of, in order to maintain safety, you try to be the good kid, the perfect kid, or the best employee, or whatever it is to manage the threat. I include it here because when we're talking about trauma informed care more broadly, I think it's helpful to understand that even those clients who do everything right, that want to be the best client, that are kind of people pleasing, might be enacting their own trauma responses, even though as a provider, it might feel really good that they're doing everything that they need to do. I mention these because these responses show up all the time when we're stressed out. Um, and but when we've had trauma, when we've had particularly chronic or complex trauma, these stress responses consistently go are activated over and over and over again. And that essentially raises your baseline so that it takes more to get you stressed out, right? And that you're constantly at this level of stress and activation and hypervigilance that it feels normal to you. And we see this a lot with kids who maybe grow up where there's a lot of community and gang violence, that they're constantly at this elevated level of stress response. And so when we try to put in place interventions, folks who are homeless fall into the same category. When we try to put in place an intervention, they might be um, flat, they might be dull, they might not be as able to engage because their systems have been responding and thinking about this for so long that that's their new normal. And so, as we think about it for ourselves, as well as for the families we serve, I just want you to keep in mind what it really looks like on this level of seeing this activation and knowing that our folks are likely getting activated a lot because that is what their body has taught them to do. Now, in terms of the long-term impact of health and relational impacts of trauma, we know, I already mentioned this, there's a higher risk of chronic conditions such as mental health challenges and substance use and misuse among those who've experienced trauma. That in our daily functioning, there's might be difficulty with concentration and paying attention, with memory. This is something that you see a lot, decision making, and this can show up as challenges in school, work, maintaining stability. And so many of our families that come to seek services are having these same challenges that maybe you've explained 3 times what's going to happen next, and they're not holding on to the information. It's because their brains are so used to looking and scanning for how to be safe and protected, or they're constantly escalated, and so they don't know how to calm down, right? So that ability to maintain stability can be particularly challenging and difficult. We also see differences in relationships and connections. So remember that complex trauma, that if the person whose job it is to take care of you is the person who hurts you, your ability to form and maintain what we would call healthy relationships is absolutely um, can be challenging. And I just saw the question pop through about ADHD. There's absolutely a co-occurrence. The research is still emerging. There are folks who can have ADHD without a trauma history, but one of the things we see often is that kids particularly who come in, if they don't see a trauma-informed provider who understands what we're talking about today, their behavior can look so much like ADHD that they automatically get put on the pathway of ADHD, but it could be a very different thing. And then if we actually are able to provide trauma-focused, trauma-informed services, we can help them stabilize their nervous system so that it may not, those difficulty concentrating behaviors may not show up. So absolutely they can look exactly the same but have different etiologies. So part of our job as providers is to be curious and ask questions and wonder. And y'all are on this training, so I think you're well poised for those kinds of questions. So the key takeaway here is trauma is not just what has happened in the past. It shapes our health, our behavior, and our relationships across the lifespan. Now, if this is new to you, if this is your very first trauma training, your Trauma 101 training, one, I encourage you to do more in-depth Trauma 101. I think there's some trainings available that you can do, but this might be mind-blowing. You might be having a lot of ahas going off right now and starting to look at your own experiences and how they've impacted you. And I just invite you to take a deep breath. It's okay, one step at a time. I invite the curiosity. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you, but I do think that as a society, we have often undervalued how trauma impacts us. And so participating and being in this work um, really means we can be champions in it going forward. So if you're inspired and curious after hearing this, that's a good thing. And be willing just to take that time and then show up in that way. And this is a great segue into how trauma shows up in our work itself. So we see it both in clients and we see it in our team members and staff. So one, if we're thinking about the clients that we serve, what we see, and I will just say kind of right from the beginning here that folks who have experienced trauma, who've come in to access services, can sometimes be those fond clients who want to do everything right and want to please everybody, but can oftentimes be the clients that are most difficult to engage. They might rise to anger or get activated easily. They might feel frustrated with services. They've accessed a lot of services and it hasn't worked out for them. So there's a lot of difficulty trusting staff and systems. And as providers, we come in with this desire. We come to this work for the all for the right reasons. I mean, I doubt anybody came into this work for the money, right? These aren't systems where we're highly compensated. We do this because we feel a deep connection and to this work, and that this is something that's important to us, and these families are important to us. So these are clients that often come in mistrusting the system, and that can be frustrating for us as providers because we have good intentions, but we don't always know what their experiences are like coming to us. I did want to acknowledge, I see there's a great conversation in the chat. That's above and beyond what we can talk about today, but such important um, content and understanding in terms of autism, ADHD, and trauma. There's a lot of professionals who've been spending a lot of time in all of those areas trying to tease apart and understand how these are interconnected. So I just want to acknowledge, I see Megan, I see John, I see some great comments in there. So the other kind of ways that trauma can show up is strong emotional reactions. So this might be the clients that get angry, they might be passive aggressive, frustrated, they might be afraid. I don't know about you, but it can be really scary to access. I know I've recently accessed a couple new healthcare providers I've never accessed before, and I was nervous going to that first appointment, imagining what our families feel like showing up for these very first appointments. We also see kind of withdrawal. This nothing's helped before. This is helpless. This is hopeless. Why do I want to engage in this? And the thing that I think is so challenging about trauma work, whether you're a provider, whether you're a client seeking it out, is it really, we have, those who've experienced it, you've developed a way of going about your world and your life in the way that works best for you, where maybe you're not triggered, where maybe this is not something that you have to think about. And when you access the services, it brings up all of those feelings. And it really is something that gets far worse before it gets better. And I don't think as providers, we acknowledge that enough. We think, but we're providing this great service. It's really important. It's really helpful. We know how beneficial it is. We know how important it is. And we want to make sure our families access these services. But the reality is it's really hard. And it often brings up a lot of emotions that can feel overwhelming and like they won't end. Now, I would say in my years and years of work with folks that that is a temporary rise that then gets better and stabilizes. And I could say that if you engage 100% of the time. So I believe in the work, but it is absolutely terrifying when you're first engaging to have this all these feelings come up. Feels like you're constantly uncovering things that you maybe put in a drawer and locked up and hoped would never come out again. So if we're talking about being trauma informed, the first thing I want everybody on this call to understand is is come to it with grace and dignity on how hard it is to show up and to open up that drawer that has been locked, that has been folks have put aside. And if you take nothing else away, just that, just knowing what it takes for somebody to show up and that it will get harder before it gets easier, whether you're going to trauma focused treatment or more broad trauma informed care, because I think there's absolutely room for all of it. And these feelings can lead to this avoidance of services or sudden disengagement. So you imagine you go in going, I'm going to feel better, and then you get worse. You start to not get worse, but like the feelings start to come up because you open that drawer. You might get disengaged and not want to go anymore. We would often have folks, unless we explain this to them, which I think is why it's so important, and I'm explaining it to you now, folks get freaked out and they stop coming. They stop engaging in the services. And this is often why, on top of all of the tangible reasons why it can be hard for our families to engage in services. And we also see trouble concentrating, following through, or remembering details. So you remember I was talking about clients who maybe you explain to them what's happening next and they don't remember any of it. I would absolutely suggest that um, give it to them in lots of different ways and understand why they may not be holding all of the information, right? Their memory function, if it's a long-term exposure to trauma, their memory may not be working the way that ideally we would want it to, or they're just spending all their resources in just trying to survive right now. So it can be hard to take this additional work on. So our families show up and they're not easy, right? They show up with making us the enemy, being frustrated by services. This is normal. And I think why why it's important for me that as staff members, as folks working in the system, that we manage and are aware of our own trauma experiences, is that our families can bring all of that up in us. Like everybody, I've had my own experiences and I've had clients that I dreaded because they've reminded me of something that was very painful and difficult for me. And so, really being able as to understand our own humanity and to welcome that in and to be curious. So, in the same way you're curious about this training, to be curious about how maybe various clients are affecting you and why, and what that might be bringing up for you. Um, so now there's other ways our trauma shows up in our work in terms of us, right? So I've already a little bit talked about this. One is compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. So these are kind of different things. Compassion fatigue is your exhaustion from doing the work, a little different than burnout. compassion fatigue is kind of the exhaustion from caring, whereas burnout is kind of being frustrated at the organizational level. And then secondary traumatic stress is when you keep hearing these trauma stories and you take them home and you have your own kind of trauma response where you're focusing and thinking about what this particular client has experienced. And it might be giving you nightmares. I've certainly had dreams about what my clients have experienced. There's burnout, which I alluded to, as well as moral distress, which is this kind of challenge of dealing with um, this the things that might be happening that doing things in your job that might conflict with your moral values, your moral compass, right? The conflict here. We also see conflict or miscommunication. So teams that are under a lot of stress probably may not be the best communicators with one another. They have frustration, they have lower engagement, and we also see this kind of numbing or over identifying with clients. And sometimes as providers, we have to be really careful about that to make sure that we're keeping that distance. And so when you want to maybe do more or connect more to clients, really questioning and looking at that in a little bit more detail. Now, at organizations, I've seen many of us work at what we would call trauma exposed organizations. This means that the work is specifically on trauma. And in these kinds of organizations, we see high staff turnover, we see rigid policies that may re-traumatize, right? So we, at this organizational level, maybe some ways in which we connect with clients, or they can be re-traumatizing as well. We see inconsistent communication and transparency, as well as difficulty sustaining morale and trust. So the key takeaway here is trauma doesn't just affect clients, it can shape interactions, teams, and entire organizations. Recognizing the signs helps us respond with compassion and care. Now, next is a chat prompt. What's one behavior you've seen that might be better understood through a trauma lens? So take a moment and feel free to type those responses in the chat. No shows, cancellations, aggressions towards others, right? Angry outbursts, avoidance. Okay, frequent no-shows, resistance, dishonesty. Okay, aggression, no follow-through, overthinking. Okay, so great ones. Getting sick frequently. Okay. Okay, so now we've talked about a lot of heavy duty stuff. So what I want to do is we're going to do just a 60-second grounding exercise. I'll turn off my camera, you'll turn off your camera, and I want you just to place your hand on your heart and one on your belly, take some slow breaths, and look around, and in your mind, notice 3 things you see, 2 things you hear, and 1 thing you feel. And so we'll just take a minute or 2 just to reground, because you might be thinking about your own experiences. There might be a lot going through your mind right now. So we're going to take this moment to reground, and we will come back. Okay, so this is great. I'm seeing some of what folks are seeing. Stapler, tape dispenser, pens, printer and keys. So hopefully that grounding exercise, this is just something as you're doing trauma-informed work, is wonderful to integrate into your daily practice, because it can get overwhelming before we know it. especially if it reminds us of our own experiences, if it's just frustrating, if somebody just yelled at us and we think we have to keep going. And we can take 60 seconds or 2 minutes and do this kind of grounding exercise, and that sets us up. What it does, and this is a whole brain thing, but we get activated. It's the emotional side of our brain versus our cognitive brain, which is the front part of our brain. And those two parts of the brain can't be working at the same time. And so it's hard for us to plan when we're activated, is kind of the take home there. And what grounding exercises like this do is that they take us from the emotional brain to our cognitive brain so that we can then show up for ourselves and for those around us. So this is one exercise you can practice anytime. So now we're going to dive into trauma-informed care principles. So SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has defined trauma-informed care. So this is kind of their definition. I think back in 2012, they came up with this, and it's been consistent over time. And really what they mean is that we understand how trauma is pervasive and promotes environments, and that we as providers and as organizations can promote environments of healing and recovery rather than re-traumatization. And there's 4 R's that are it's kind of central. One is we realize. So the first R is realization, realizing how trauma affects families, how it has impacts at the individual level and at the community level. So a lot of what we've talked about today, just understanding the prevalence and the impact. Number 2 um, is being able to recognize. So once we realize, we're able to recognize the signs of trauma. And then number 3 is respond. So once we recognize, we have the skills and the tools to respond by applying these trauma-informed principles across all areas of functioning. And that a trauma-informed approach seeks to resist re-traumatization, because so many of our organizations, if we aren't intentional, if we aren't curious, if we aren't managing what comes up for ourselves, and we really show up, we can actually make our services safe places versus being another service that let them down, another service where people didn't treat them with respect, right? And I think the thing that is so challenging is that when you come in to a service, many of our clients come into service expecting the worst, and in many ways not having the skills or the tools, because nobody ever taught them how to engage in ways where there's a different outcome. So they create the outcome by creating responses in us. This is not blaming. This is talking about how we bring what we fear so often into our interactions with others. Us as team members will do that too. And this is why the curiosity and the willingness to look internally is so critically important. So we want to resist this re-traumatization. Now, why does it matter for everyone? Not just, I think trauma-informed care needs to be in kind of every kind of system, not just child and family serving systems. I think it needs to be like everywhere because we know the prevalence is so high. We know it's connected to workplace burnout and overall well-being. If you're constantly getting triggered, you're going to get burnt out. Secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, that kind of caring, taking it home with you. Trauma among professionals in the general population, as well as service quality and retention. We all want to provide exceptional services, and we want our clients to engage so that they can access those services. Now, SAMHSA has 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach. The first, and we'll just briefly walk through these principles. The first one is safety. So ensuring that people, clients, and team members feel physically and psychologically safe in their environment. That's kind of all it is. But I say all it is, and I really should say it in quotes. Safety is so profound, and there's social media really has picked up on this idea that creating these safe spaces can be takes is really something critical and takes a lot of foresight and forethought. Trustworthiness and transparency. It's really building and maintaining trust through clear communication, consistency, and transparency in decision making. Peer support, recognizing the value of connection with others who have lived experience of trauma, building those healing relationships with mutual support, right? That the idea of those who've experienced it can sometimes be the best healers, can help guide us through the other side because we know what it's like to be in that hole, right? And help guide us out of that hole. In addition, collaboration and mutuality, so reducing power differentials, nothing about us without us, fostering partnership between staff and clients, and emphasizing that healing happens in relationships. So Bessel van der Kolk, who is a great trauma kind of psychiatrist, wrote The Body Keeps the Score, which if you haven't read it and you're interested in trauma, I highly recommend that you do so. And he really talks about how trauma occurs within relationships. So that complex trauma that we talked about, as does healing. And so earlier I'd mentioned, there's space for trauma-focused treatment as well as these broader services and supports. And what I really mean by that is no matter what your role is, you play a critical part in helping families heal from trauma. So when you talk with folks who have gone through a healing journey and are reflecting back, they will often mention that this person at the front desk, this janitor at this place, was kind to them and it made them want to come back. That's where healing happens. I often, when I used to work at the Chadwick Center, one of the things I'd share with our front desk staff is so often families coming in that waiting room are coming in on maybe the worst day of their life. If there's been disclosure of abuse and they're coming in for services, but just the idea of crossing the threshold to really partake of the services can be terrifying. And so that front desk is critical in making sure that folks feel welcomed. Yet when we do trauma informed care training, how often do we include our front desk professionals in the training? So that's something, maybe you are a front desk professional, and I love that you're here, but if you represent an organization where those folks haven't gone through this kind of training, you might want to consider having them participate in something like that. I know that's something we put into place is our front desk participates all in trauma-informed care training. So really just encouraging that everybody plays a role as part of the healing journey. Empowerment, voice, and choice is the next principle. So prioritizing client and staff strengths, giving opportunities for choice and autonomy, and affirming their resilience, right? They get to be a part of this. This is their experience, their life. We bring our own sense of and knowledge of the resources that are out there, of these impacts. There's a lot that we bring to the table as providers and professionals, but there's also a lot that they bring to the table in terms of their own experiences, what helps them, what are their strengths, what's helped them engage in the past. They're the expert on their own lives. No matter what we learn in trainings or school or in previous client interactions, they're the experts on their own lives. And finally, we have cultural, historical, and gender issues. So actively moving past cultural stereotypes and biases, recognizing and addressing historical trauma, offering culturally responsive, gender-sensitive services. So trauma-informed equals equity-informed. Okay, let's go on to the next slide here. So now what I invite you to do is think about, and I'll go back to the previous slide so you can reflect, but you also have them in your participant guide, is think about which of those feels most important in your role. Now you can absolutely type it in the chat, but this really, you don't need to. This is your own journaling prompt to quietly reflect and think about what might be most important in your role. Right, I was going to go back here. So these are the six in case you're forgetting what they were. We're going to go ahead and go forward, but these are on page 6 in case you want to refer back to them. Now, we're going to talk about the practical applications of trauma-informed care. Oh, thank you, Michelle, transparency. And I know a bunch of others are going to start to come through as well. So there's 4 that I've really identified. There's the principles, but really thinking about how to make them real, how to make them things that we can actually do in our practice every day to support client well-being as well as our own well-being. Safety, boundaries, empowerment, and trust. So the first one is safety. And I already alluded to the fact that safety itself could be unpacked as, a day-long training. So when we're talking about safety, is feeling, okay, so there's physical safety. So being physically safe from what is occurring. So that could be out of the home where there's domestic violence into the safer community, right? But we know in trauma that you can be physically safe yet still feel psychologically unsafe. In fact, that's one of the hallmarks of having, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, is that re-experiencing, that reminder that it all started when we talked about Vietnam vets. If you read Body Keeps the Score, you actually get a great history on what happened when men were coming back, and women. If you've read The Women by Kristen Hanna, women were in Vietnam too, as medical providers. Highly recommend it, although it is heavy on the trauma. That when they come back, they would hear cars backfiring, and that would be a trigger. So they'd be physically safe, right? But they wouldn't feel psychologically safe. And that lack of safety is what leads to irritability, hypervigilance, lack of engagement, lack of paying attention. It really is foundational and core. So, in order to help folks, so as providers, part of what we can do is create predictability, clarity, and respect in interactions and environments. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that actually means. Now, why does safety matter with trauma-informed care? Those who've experienced trauma may have fear about their own safety, which we've talked about, or the safety of their loved ones, right? I've done a lot of work with kids, particularly kids exposed to domestic violence. That's kind of where I started my career. And what they carry with them about wondering if when they come home, if, for example, mom is going to be safe, was something that impacted their ability to show up and engage at school, falling asleep in class, getting in fights, all of these things, because they were holding these big fears about safety every single day. And they have difficulty in trusting others to protect them. So if they haven't been protected before and actually hurt by those who are supposed to protect them, you can understand why having a provider show up and say, I'm going to help you through this, may not feel very compelling in that moment. They might also be hyper aware of potential threats, right? Constantly scanning their environment in ways that they wouldn't even be able to tell you or explain. And for your own experiences, you're scanning, right? And so this is happening. So it can be hard to actually be present, which is why grounding exercises like the one we just did are so important. And also have problems controlling their responses to perceived threats. People give rise to anger, rise to sadness, fleeing, right? Because something has come up that they're so activated about. And they really are these trauma reminders, excuse me. So when faced with people, situations, or places or things that remind them of these events, like the example I gave of folks coming home from Vietnam, individuals may re-experience the intense and disturbing feelings tied to the original trauma. Here's something that I think is really interesting. They've actually done studies on the brain that when somebody is experiencing a trauma reminder, It activates the exact same part of the brain that was activated when the trauma occurred. So it doesn't show up in the memory part of the brain. It shows up in the current experience of the brain. So for their brain, the trauma is happening again. I want you to really understand that. This is not something that they're making up or they're trying to, it's not just a memory, it is a present experience. And so again, grounding exercises like the one we just did and a reminder of we're here now and that's separate actually pulls it decouples those connections so that it becomes a memory, not a current event. So what grounding does is decouples the memory. So it is an event that happened to them, not what is currently happening. Their brain can come to understand it differently. And what we see when they're experiencing these events is that um, behaviors are out of place, kind of the anger, the frustration, the rage, that in the current situation, these behaviors don't make sense, right? You'd be like, wow, I just said this and suddenly you're all over me on it, right? But in the moment, it was actually helpful and appropriate. So, really being able to help decouple that is critical. So I have a quick video here on why psychological safety is important that we're gonna just take a moment to watch.
To create a happy and productive working environment, it is important that everyone feels comfortable enough to be themselves and able to express their own unique personality, rather than having to pretend to be just like everyone else to fit in. It's also important that people feel they are able to make mistakes while they learn and grow, instead of being criticized for not getting it right the first time. This is why creating an environment of psychological safety is crucial. Studies have shown that boosting psychological safety in the workplace leads to more confidence, increased creativity and innovation, improved productivity, and elevated trust. Psychological safety is also key to improving diversity and inclusion, enhancing teamwork, and creating a culture where taking risks and thinking outside the box is encouraged. And making people's unseen values visible, Attune helps create pathways to mutual understanding and open communication, laying the foundations for building an environment where psychological safety can flourish.
Okay, so in this video, they're talking, I kind of did an introduction about why psychological safety is important. And what they're talking about here is why it's so important in organizations. Because when we have cultures in organizations where people feel like they're going to get in trouble all the time for making errors, it activates this same response. I've done something wrong. I'm going to get in trouble, right? Whatever that is, right? If so, as leaders thinking about this, when we create those environments, we activate people's nervous systems, right? Because ours probably are. Usually when we're being critical of others, it's not because we're coming from our best self, right? Usually we can be productive and supportive and give proper feedback when we're coming from our best self. But when we're negative and critical and judgmental, that's probably not the self we want to show up. And that's usually a sign that something is happening for us. And when we do that with our team members, the same thing can happen in that they'll feel judged, their nervous system will get activated, and then they'll be on this ongoing um, uh, spiral of feeling like they're activated as well. And then they can get in more trouble because they're in their emotional brain, not in their cognitive brain. Okay. Now, how do we cultivate safety with our clients? We've talked about why it's so important. One is creating predictability, right? Predictable routines, explaining what will happen next, and often and ideally in multiple different ways. Using a calm voice and body language. Part of what happens, and there's all these studies on it, is that when individuals get activated, it kind of gets, it can get us activated as well. And then we kind of mirror their response. And all that does is become additive in nature. So if we mirror their response, then they up the ante, and then we mirror again and they up the ante. And so part of it is just, no matter what, having this calm, reassuring voice. Um, and then designing environments that reduce triggers. So things like kind of lighting, making sure things are private so people can't overhear what might be happening, reducing noise as much as possible, warm colors, not having, you know, sometimes you can't help it, but if law enforcement's coming in all the time, that can kind of put people on edge. So really doing environmental scans for what creates safety. Now, you all work in vastly different environments, but really taking some time to look and see what that might look like for you. Now, at the team level, promoting psychological safety can look like letting folks speak without fear of punishment, right? Having that open conversation repeatedly, being consistent and transparent about policies and decisions. So often, one of the things we hear when we're talking to team members is that they didn't know what was going to happen. Nobody talked to them about it. And as leaders, I think it can be hard to know what to say, when you should say it, how to be transparent without creating anxiety. So really having a plan of what makes sense of how to share information. Now, you probably don't need to share all the details, but kind of a general overview of what's happening can be really helpful and decrease some of that anxiety, as well as modeling respect in meetings and communication. So just generally taking yourself to task in the same way you would take others to task for how do we create a respectful environment. Now, in the chat, I'd love to see what's one practice you use or could use to help someone feel safe in your role. Authenticity. Great, Megan. Emily. Safe spaces for folks in cubicle land. Listening, sincerity. I think, Emily, a lot of it is how cubicles, I will be very honest, and my husband is somebody who's had a trauma experience where he was attacked, and working in cubicles where people would come up behind him, and he wouldn't mind me sharing this at all, was very activating for him, like very activating, because it reminded him of that experience. And so what you're talking about is several conversations that we've had at home about how to create safety in that environment. And so some of it is how you might orient the desk. So maybe being able to see who's coming, being able to wear headphones, being able to have clear boundaries on when people might interrupt you. So it's really thinking about what might make me feel safe in this, accepting the premise that you're in the cubicle, what things can happen to help minimize noise, distress, schedule times, kind of these things to make sure that we have predictability and clarity on expectations. So I'm just seeing so many great things, sharing an agenda prior to the meeting. So hopefully you're getting a chance to read through these as well. I'm not going to read through all of them. But again, we have such a wide variety of experiences on this call. So I love reading this, and thank you for sharing your wisdom. Honesty. Oh, Daisy, not agreeing with everything. Completely. I think that's fantastic. And actually the research on psychological safety is, especially organizational psychological safety, is so much about not just being nice and agreeable, but being clear and having good boundaries, and being and making expectations clear is so important. Okay, so we're going to go on, actually a great segue into boundaries. So I'm kind of obsessed with boundaries. I think it touches on everything within trauma-informed care, and it's maybe something that we don't talk enough about in these kind of trauma-informed care 101 presentations. So when I talk about boundaries, what I'm talking about are these clear, consistent limits around roles, responsibilities, and expectations. And that we've all met folks who might have really rigid boundaries, but there's no flexibility, there's no compassion about it. There's really just this is my boundary, don't cross it or you're in trouble. And I really like to think of boundaries as ways in which we identify truly what we need, what our clients need, what's appropriate, what's professional. We make that clear. And then there's a lot of room within that to facilitate connection. I actually think that when I set good boundaries for myself, the intention is not to keep me blocked or kind of away from the world. It's actually to enable me to facilitate opportunities to connect, that there are things that I need in order to be a better connector in the world, not just to be protected. I hope that that makes sense. And maybe think through what that means. Boundaries aren't just protection, they're the guardrails by which we can communicate and connect better. So in trauma-informed care, trauma often blurs or violates boundaries. And in fact, one of the hallmarks of trauma is that a boundary has been violated. In no matter what kind of trauma you're talking about, there's usually some sort of boundary violation that has taken place in a profound way. And that healthy boundaries build trust, reduce stress, and prevent re-traumatization. Now, when we don't have good boundaries, we often experience emotional exhaustion, resentment, or frustration. We might leave work. So if we're talking to the workforce here, to all of you, we might leave work emotionally exhausted, right? Because we feel used up. We feel like our boundaries have been violated all day. We might have a hard time saying no. This was so hard for me, in terms of as I developed in my professional career. I'm somebody who probably met the fawning nervous system response where I said yes to everything. And in some ways that was good because I got to participate in a lot of great things and really engage and learn. But I just got tired because I was saying yes to everything. So as I've gotten older, the beauty of getting older is really being able to recognize and connect with what are your real no's and what is your capacity, and being really clear about that and taking some time to really think about it. And when we don't have these good boundaries, we often feel disconnected from our purpose. And I think purpose is one of the most important things that we can cultivate, especially right now, and our values, because we're saying yes to everything, which means we're saying yes to all kinds of things that may violate our purpose and values. But when we have healthy boundaries, and this is for the folks we help as well, there's greater clarity on what's ours and what we actually need to do. There's this better connection, which I talked about. So boundaries not for protection, but to enable opportunities for connection. That we actually have more consistent emotional regulation, that we're more able to show up and be present versus being kind of always bombarded. And so I say this to you as providers, but I also think this is a really important conversation to happen with the families you serve. Because again, individuals who've experienced trauma have often had their boundaries violated. And as a result, they might not be very good at keeping your boundaries. There's some folks who are calling at all hours, who expect to be kind of maybe you to go above and beyond for them that maybe you aren't able to do, whatever it might be, right? We see that. So a conversation about healthy and good boundaries and what it means and why it's important can be critical. So this is as much for you as for the families that you serve. And when we protect these boundaries, when we have set boundaries, expectations, appointment times, what I can and can't do for you, right? We have increased energy and ability to be present in the moment. We're not constantly reactive. I've worked in trauma exposed organizations my whole career, and one of the hallmarks is working from a place of reactivity instead of responding, right? Because we're constantly trying to put out every fire all the time. But when we have clarity on what's ours, what our purpose is, what we can do for our clients, what is within our role, what our clients need, that allows us to really lean into that space versus trying to be everything for everybody. And then that's protection from compassion fatigue, right? Because compassion fatigue comes when we're the helpers who care, but we get overwhelmed and exhausted by the process of caring. And that's often because we've violated our boundaries. So here are some myths and truths about boundaries. One is boundaries are selfish. Maybe you've been told that explicitly or implicitly, maybe at home, maybe at work. But the reality is boundaries honor both your needs and the other's needs by creating clear expectations and healthier relationships. If I set boundaries, people will be upset with me. This was a big one for me. Healthy relationships can and should be able to tolerate and even grow from clear boundaries. Discomfort is normal, but not a sign you're doing something wrong. So there's a difference between discomfort and there being something wrong. Good leaders or good team members, fill in the blank here, are always available, right? That was a big one for me. I was always available. Didn't matter to who, what it was. I was going to be a good soldier, right? But what we really know is no matter what your role is, leader, team members, model sustainable work by setting limits on their availability. This encourages others to do the same, right? I actually love that our culture has shifted to where this is more acceptable. I know when I was kind of coming up over the last 25 years, I had leaders who were I once had a leader who told me that they never, even on vacation, there was never a day in 15 years in which they didn't do some work. Vacations, weekends, right? Did work all the time. And that was what I grew up hearing, like, oh my God, to be successful, to lean into this work, I need to be that. I'm not sure I have that in me. This person seemed to be okay with it. I'm not, right? So and that most of us aren't. So really being a leader, being somebody who actually models healthy boundaries makes work sustainable for everybody else. Boundaries mean saying no to everything. That's not true either. They're about discernment, deciding when to say yes and where no protects your time, energy, and values. Once I set a boundary, it will always hold, or boundaries push people away. But actually, when we have strong boundaries, we're better able to support those around us long term. And we have to reassert our boundaries ongoing. Sometimes the hardest part is not setting the boundary, it's keeping the boundary. So how do we cultivate boundaries with clients? Respect personal limits on disclosure or participation, right? So being really clear on what's to be shared here and not, stating confidentiality and service boundaries, and normalize saying no or asking for breaks, right? So much is mirroring it for your clients. With teams, encourage staff to set limits on workload and availability. Leadership models healthy boundaries, so not emailing at midnight if you can help it. Set it up to at least be delivered in the morning versus being delivered at all hours of the night. And protecting staff from role creep, which happens so much in child and health human services organizations because there's so much work to do and never enough staff and resources to do it, right? But how can we protect staff? Because I've had staff who are superstars who just jump in and do everything. And it's amazing because, oh my gosh, this person's a godsend. They do everything. And inevitably they burn out, right? Inevitably they feel taken advantage of, they get frustrated and they leave. So part of what we want to do is really respecting their boundaries and kind of avoiding this creep, having clarity on job roles and responsibilities. So our next journaling prompt here on page 10 of the participant guide, Think of a recent situation where you had to set a boundary. How did it affect your ability to stay present and connected? This is not for the chat. This is for your own personal journaling. You can do it in the participant guide if you have that printed or available, or you can just jot it on a piece of paper next to you. So I'm going to give you a minute to do that, and then we will go on to the next. You definitely don't need to put this in the chat. I think this is probably very personal. When we talk about boundaries, there's usually very personal reasons why something might impact your ability to stay present and connected. So this is not something you need to share, but for your own reflection. And I think it's important because it often comes up. So being aware of what it is can be really important. Okay, we're going to go ahead and go on to empowerment. So empowerment really is connected to restoring that voice, choice, and control to people who feel powerless, highlighting strengths and resilience, not just needs. Now, why does empowerment matter in trauma-informed care? So trauma often takes away autonomy. When we talk about power and our own personal power, our ability to make our own decisions, often trauma has completely taken that away. The ability to control your own body, your own environment, whatever it might be. And empowerment fosters healing, resilience, and engagement. And so it really allows us to give autonomy back in a way that is healthy and promotes that healing. Now, how do we cultivate empowerment in our clients? Right? What are ways in which we can give voice, choice, and control back to our clients? One is to offer meaningful choices. It might be something as small as order of tasks, treatment options, really working with them, right? But in some ways, and this is not an attempt to infantilize any of the families, people we serve. I think it's just is a good way to work with people. It's sometimes like working with children. So we've got a lot of folks in daycare. If a child is overwhelmed and wants this and you can't provide it for them, often saying, you can do this or this. This isn't an option, but this or this are the options. And I think for all of us, that can be a great way of really providing boundaries, clarity, and empowering them to make those decisions. Also, celebrating small successes and acknowledging courage. I mentioned it before. I recently went to physical therapy for the first time, right? Now physical therapy is not like human services in the way that any of us do this work, right? It's kind of a standard way in which many people engage in a type of service. And I was anxious, right? I was anxious. What is it going to be? Who am I going to meet? What should I say? How do I describe what's going on with me? And so really thinking about how that might translate to our clients, showing up at our spaces, or if we're going to their house, or if we're going to their facility, whatever it might be, knowing that there's a lot of anxiety. So acknowledging the courage to show up and be there in that moment is so critical. And collaborating on goals instead of prescribing solutions. So how do we make sure that we're working together, that we bring a lot to the table, but so do they? So really encouraging that collaboration. Now, how do we cultivate empowerment on staff and teams? One is as much as possible, and sometimes this is impossible, is possible, and sometimes it's not, but involving staff in decisions that impact their work, right? Understanding maybe what is outside of our control, but then what is within our control there. How can that look within these parameters? Recognizing professional expertise and lived experience equally. I've mentioned this several times, that somebody as a leader versus the person who's just joined. I mean, even on this training, we have so many great experiences, and there's expertise in all of them. Our interns are getting the best research, most recent, when's how we don't often keep up to date on that, but our interns have access to it, right? So really working together to recognize the expertise that we all bring to the table and encouraging innovation and autonomy while providing support. So how do we, within, again, the parameters, what are things that we can do right now? Now, again, I'm going to invite you in your own personal journal, whether it's a piece of paper, the participant guide on page 12, or anywhere else. What's one small way you could offer more choice or voice in your role this week? Okay. Hopefully you have some good ideas there. So our final kind of strategy, I'm not giving up. Thanks. Thanks, Magda. Trust. So what is trust? Trust is so many things. Again, this is something you could spend a day on. But when I'm talking about trust in a trauma-informed context, I'm talking about reliability, honesty, and transparency in our relationships. So essentially following through on what you say you're going to do, being somebody who is trustworthy, not over-promising, but also not saying you're going to do something and then not doing it. I know so many of us come with good intentions and would like to be able to offer more than we can. I know I've made that mistake where I think I could do something that I couldn't do. So being really clear about what you can and cannot do in your role is really key to what fosters trust in this work. So in trauma often involves a betrayal or broken trust. Again, it's a hallmark, it's a foundation of the trauma experience that trust in some way, shape, or form has been violated. Even if it's a natural disaster, it's a trust that the world is safe or that this thing won't happen that has been violated. And trust is essential for engagement because folks won't be coming back if they don't trust you. And in many ways, this is foundational to everything else. We won't be able to retain our employees if there isn't an environment of trust, and it's impossible to facilitate healing without trust being present. So how can we cultivate trust in our clients? Again, being transparent about what you can and cannot do, following through on your commitments consistently. So saying it and then following through on it, sharing information openly and honestly, even when the answer may not be something someone wants to hear. So there was in the chat earlier about honesty, right? We have to, the things that can maybe be most challenging, saying the thing that nobody wants to hear, saying the unfortunate. We need to still be committed to doing that, whether it's to our clients or to our teams. And one thing you can say is, I don't have the answer yet, but I'll find out and I'll let you know by this time, right? So how do we cultivate trust in our staff and teams? So leadership sharing decisions and rationale, not just outcomes. So really walking through the complexity. And I think that for so much of this work, that is the challenge, is nothing is black and white. In trauma, nothing is black and white. Things are so complex. So acknowledging that complexity in itself can build trust. Admit mistakes and repair ruptures quickly. So often, like I'll tell you, I hate making mistakes. I am going to be my worst enemy when it comes to making a mistake. But I've also learned the most when I've made mistakes, and I've appreciated when somebody talked to me in a caring and compassionate way about the mistake I made. And if we frame mistakes as learning opportunities, that's such a great way to build trust. Because so often, and this can, for our staff and for our clients, honestly, when somebody doesn't do something correctly, it can bring up all of our nervous system responses. The second we think we're not good enough, we move into reactivity and emotionality, right? But if we create cultures where we understand mistakes are part of the learning process, because they absolutely are, some of the best learning happens when you learn what not to do first. I mean, think about it in your own experience. I know I have example after example of mistakes I made where I will never make that mistake again. And I actually became very, very good at something, right? And I'm not an anomaly here. We're all learn that way. That's how our brains are wired. So understanding and commitment to learning. And then building consistency and supervision, feedback, and recognition. So having systems and staff being aware. This also builds safety. This also builds empowerment. So all of these things work together. None of these are, I kind of have them as 4 groups, but you've probably already noticed that doing one of these probably helps in all 4. Now, here's your journal prompt for this one. Who is, and again, this is very personal, so this is not a chat response. Um, Who is someone in your work who trusts you, and what did you do to build that trust? Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to keep going. But again, you have this on page 14 of your participant guide. If you want to revisit it, you have access to all the slides and the participant guide. Okay, so this one is for the chat. When we think about these 4 areas, safety, boundaries, empowerment, or trust, which of these do you already practice regularly and which feels like an area of growth? So if you type in the chat, maybe um, uh, regularly equals growth equals that you can maybe share that with the group. So let's say you're really great at safety. So regularly equals safety, but you need to work on your boundaries. So growth equals boundaries. Just reflect for a moment and then go ahead and type that in the chat. Regularly boundaries, practice trust, could grow in boundaries, or you have growth boundaries, role creep is a big issue. You are not alone there. Trust and safety, regularly empowerment, growth equals boundaries. Really trust, great. Regularly boundaries, safety, that's great. Growth equals boundaries. Boundaries I want to work on. Yeah, there's a reason I'm kind of obsessed. Some of you are really good at it, but I've just found, so for many of us, the conversation about boundaries and healthy boundaries and what they mean and how to keep them in the workplace has been one of those things that there's just so many opportunities for growth and learning. To work on boundaries. It's great. Okay, so now we're going to take our lens back a little bit and talk about workforce well-being and organizational culture. So trauma doesn't always only affect our clients, it affects our staff, which we've talked about, but also I have found that organizations often have their own kind of collective historical trauma culture. An exposure to client trauma can lead to secondary traumatic stress, as we've talked about, compassion fatigue, and burnout. And organizational culture can either buffer stress or it can actually amplify it. And thinking, well, so I'm going to go to our next slide, which has a video I'm going to share.
Lisa, I don't think that we're able to hear it. So,
Oh, we're not hearing it?
yeah.
Okay. Ah, okay. Maybe what I'll do in the interest of time is I'll just move on to the next and we can share the video link when we send
Yeah,
stuff out.
absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay, well, it's very funny. So if you want a little bit of a snicker, you can click on the link when you get the slides. But it really is talking about how organizational culture is one of those things that we can get stuck in and really we can maybe get in our own have blinders on for the solutions, and that maybe being able to take a step back and maybe look and be a little bit more creative can help take some of those blinders off. And the importance of doing that in our organizational cultures, particularly as we are trying to be more trauma informed. So some of the common challenges we see and why we have blinders on are these high caseloads, right? Limited resources. It feels like it gets worse every day. Moral distress from working with systemic boundaries, doing things that maybe you don't align with your own personal ethics and morals. Stigma about asking for help or admitting overwhelm, folks wanting to be good soldiers, wanting to do the right thing, and being afraid of what might happen if they make a mistake. Um, And then staff turnover. So what happens if we don't prioritize well-being and then we have to consistently train new staff, right? That can be really challenging from an organizational perspective. And how can we protect staff well-being? One is just normalizing these conversations about stress and resilience, encouraging the use of grounding, so like we did, reflection and peer support. When knowing, for some organizations, EAP might be a great resource. I've also heard that sometimes it's not the best resource. It really depends who you are, where you are, who your EAP is, but really providing that as a resource and normalizing it. I think the thing that we often inadvertently do is send the message that asking for help means you're the exception, not the rule. And whether it's for yourself, whether it's for your team, really making sure to prioritize that we're humans and we were drawn to this work, so many of us, because we are sensitive, caring, desire to make a difference. And that it is precisely because we are built to be empathic and caring that we will sometimes be personally impacted and affected, that it is part of the work, it's not the exception to the work. So as much as we can normalize a culture where these conversations happen, where we acknowledge these experiences as part of just, this is what we do, the more we can really support and protect our staff well-being and resilience. Emphasizing collective care rather than only self-care. So much previously secondary traumatic stress was so focused on self-care, but really thinking of it from an organizational perspective. And I think this first step is that normalization that I talked about. And the other is trauma-informed leadership. I will say, actually, on November 20th, I think I'm doing a whole CalTrin webinar on trauma-informed leadership. So if you are a leader and this is something of interest to you, this is just a little teaser. There's a whole webinar coming up on this. But I really think from an organizational perspective, having leaders who are practicing in a trauma-informed way, who understand what they need as leaders, and that they're able to create these and cultivate these responses for their staff is critical. So we know trauma-informed leaders recognize that trauma impacts their staff and their clients. They create psychological safety, trust, and care. They balance accountability with compassion. They model boundaries, transparency, and cultural humility. And they shift from managing people to supporting humans. And so some of the core practices, and again, we'll build on these in the webinar if you're interested, whether you're an existing leader or you want to be a leader one day. Deeper dive into safety and boundaries, modeling healthy limits, reliability and trust, following through consistently, empathy and compassion, leading with curiosity, not judgment. I love the language of curiosity, and just coming into a room and being curious about what's happening versus assuming and judgment and having a judgment about it. Transparency and accountability, owning your mistakes. We all make them, and rupturing those repairs. And cultural humility, recognizing your own power, privilege, as well as systemic inequities. So as we kind of wrap up today, we're in the last couple minutes. Practical trauma-informed practices, no matter what your role is. Clear communication and expectations, creating predictable routines, offering choices wherever possible, pausing before reacting, and normalizing breaks and self-care. So I have a couple of scenario practices. We're just going to do one today, just to kind of apply it a little bit. So let's imagine a client has missed, and this is on page 16 of your participant guide, a client misses their third appointment and arrives upset saying, "No one cares about me anyway." How might you respond in that moment? What would a trauma-informed response look or sound like? So they missed their third appointment, which for many agencies, this might mean this might be the sign that they're unable to access the service anymore because 3 times, whatever that might mean. and they say, no one cares about me anyway. What might be a nice trauma-informed response? Explore that further and express your genuine care and interest. I love that. Any other thoughts on that one? Validate and recognize their bravery. Glad you made it in today. I'm so glad you're here. We missed you, but we're glad you're here now. Curiosity about why they might believe nobody cares. That's such a great entry point. Validate their feelings, active listening and asking questions. Hey, we missed you. I'm glad you're here. I love this. A lot of I'm glad you're here and curiosity about where their feelings might be coming from. I love it. Give another chance. So many good ones. Okay, so what we're going to do now is highlight some key takeaways. Trauma is common, not rare. Many clients and staff carry trauma histories. Trauma-informed care is a shift in perspective from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you to what's strong with you. That's a newer one. If you've been in the trauma-informed care world for a long time, this one's newer. There's core principles that guide our work. Impacts are long-term and relational. Trauma shapes behavior, health, and relationships across the lifespan. And healing happens in connection and relationship. And every opportunity, whether it's the front desk, care coordinator, offers an opportunity to build trust, resilience, and hope. So as we wrap up today, your final chat prompt is, what's one small action you can take this week to bring a trauma-informed approach to your work? One small action you can take this week to bring a trauma-informed action approach to your work. So I'm going to, let's see, highlight, there's some resources. You'll get these slides. And then this is just a little bit of information about me. So you can actually connect. I have a website and trainings and stuff I offer. So you can get access to all of that through the QR